Hello, everyone. Hello. Welcome to our third event this week. This is the panel discussion. So instead of hopping right into our panel discussion with our panelists, we're going to have one of our committee members do a short presentation so you all have a little more context going into the discussion. Kevin served on our planning committee last semester as well as this semester, and Kevin has played a key role in the design for this event in specific. So he's very qualified to be giving this presentation. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Kevin.
Hello, everyone. Yeah. Okay. So, before we started the presentation, I think it's useful for all of us to just have a little bit of, insight as to what the transportation policies in the United States and China actually are, and so what the environment looks like. So, that starts with looking at why are we trying to reduce emissions? We're trying to reduce transportation emissions in order to help solve the climate crisis. So, over here we have a big statistic looking at the contributions for global greenhouse gas emissions. So, how much of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere right now, where did it come from, right? And what we find is that 25% of it comes from the United States, 22% comes from the EU, including the UK, and 12% of it comes from China, right? So we already see that there's a large amount of cumulative emissions that come from the two countries we're talking about today, the US and China. And we also went and did some graphs with the United States and China. So you might think that China that the average Chinese citizen is a lot less sustainable than the average American citizen, looking at the graph on the left. But when we adjust it for per capita, we end up finding that the average American citizen ends up polluting a lot more than the average Chinese citizen, right? And China's population is 4 times the size of the United States. So the graph on the left, China is about twice as high as the United States. It should be about 4 times as high as the United States, so double the size if they were polluting as much as an American. So that brings us to transportation, right? So let's look up the global pie up in the top right. Transportation takes up about 16% of the global emissions pie. So we know that transportation is a big part in transitioning how we transport is going to be a big part of solving the climate crisis. But when we look at the United States and China, we find that not every country matches that 16% statistic, right? China over there has a lot less emissions. Transportation is a lot smaller part of their emissions, while in the United States, it's almost 30%, right? So that has us wondering, why is it almost 30% in the United States? That's 3 times as big as it is in China. Yeah. So we looked into into China, right? So the big map on the left over there is Chinese high-speed rail, and you can notice that it's really, really dense. There's a lot of it, and most of this is true high-speed rail, so super fast, right? So China does a lot of investments into large public spending investments, right? And it does it across the state. So we have high-speed rail, and then we have a large subway expansion within each of those cities. So making sure that connectivity happens for everyone so that you can get to the station, travel in between the cities. And it's really, and that high-speed rail component is really important because airlines, as they are now, do not have electric alternatives. So you can't take electric airplanes to get from city to city. So that's why for any transportation network as it is right now, the high-speed rail is super important. The other thing they're doing is they're expanding private production. Over there is BYD, Build Your Dreams, which has sold some electric buses to LA, right? So as part of this government program, they're also trying to increase their market share of renewables. Okay, so this is the transit map of the United States. This is Amtrak. And as you may have noticed, it's a lot smaller than it is in China, right? Has a lot less connectivity. And so why is it a lot smaller? Because of that. Because in the United States, we've chosen to invest mostly in automobiles. So instead of having a lot of, instead of the trips being inside the cities being made by subways, they're being made by cars. Instead of the trips between the cities being made by high-speed rail, they're also made by cars, which is why the slice of the American pie is so much larger when it comes to transportation, is because those cars are polluting, whereas the trains, they're electric, so they're not. Right? The US has tried to address this with two recent bills. That's the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill has a lot of funds that go to projects like they would in China, as in large state-funded projects. So in the infrastructure bill, a lot of that is going to public projects such as Amtrak, funding for busways and stuff like that. And for the Inflation Reduction Act, most of that is going to private environmental firms. So environmental firms that are trying to, that are working on projects such as EV development in order to help make our transportation more sustainable, right? Yeah. And so looking at all that policy, I think before we hand it over to our panelists and introduce our panelists, I wanted to talk about just like what the average commute is like for somebody in China versus somebody in the United States. So we're looking at a street scene in two fairly similar urban situations, and you can see that there's a lot more diversity in modes on the left. There's people who are taking cars, yes, but there's also people who are walking, people on bikes. You can see that there's some freighting happening in there, right? Whereas on the right, it is entirely personal vehicles. Yeah, thank you.
Our first panelist is Dr. Yizhao Liang, professor at the School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management at the University of Oregon. Her research examines the interactions between policy, place, and people, and fostering sustainable urban environments throughout East Asia and the United States. Her present work encompasses studying voluntary local reviews in Japanese cities to identify adaptable, effective strategies for global application.
Our second panelist is Dr. Liang, professor of economics at Willamette University and Peter C. and Bonnie S. Kramer Chair. Her research specializes in modern monetary theory, economic development, international economics, and the political economy of China. Yan publishes and contributes to various journals, books, and magazines. And she is an elected board member of the Association for Evolutionary Economics and the immediate former president of the Association for Institutional Thought.
Our next panelist is Kris Strickler, the director of Oregon's Department of Transportation, focusing on the delivery of Oregon's multimodal transportation system. His background focuses on transportation engineering, obtaining his degree from Washington State University. Kris and his department work to make Oregon's transportation system innovative in economic and environmental ways. This includes creating a climate office, an office of social equity, and investing in EV infrastructure across the state.
Our final panelist is Paul Lackey, who is an experienced engineer and the president of Portland-based electric vehicle company EV Drive, a company which found itself as, quote, two guys in a garage out in Banks, Oregon. EV Drive is a company that does electric vehicle conversions for gas cars, designing how the electric components will replace the gas ones and then manually installing those electric components in-house. Visiting the EV Drive shop was one of the highlights of symposium planning. Visiting it is like visiting a cyberpunk auto shop with lots of old cars and various forms of electric transformation. It's super cool. EV Drive has has worked on electric mining vehicles, UTVs, boats, motorcycles, and electric supercars, including a world record Corvette conversion and a highly competitive Pikes Peak racer. Paul Lackey's company and his voice have been featured in places such as the New York Times, LA Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Thank you for having him today.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. I am Jessica Kleiss. I'm the director of the Environmental Studies program, and I have the honor of being the moderator for the panel discussion tonight. So even though we just had lovely introductions to each of you, I'd love to hear in your own words how your work or expertise relates to transportation, perhaps in particular the transition to electric vehicles or transportation more broadly, and in the US and or China context. So Yizhao, would you be willing to start us off and we can just go down the line?
Sure. My research primarily looked at the relationship between environment, people's behavior, health, and general well-being. So I adopt a people-centered approach to examining those relationships. This approach calls for two things. First, when you look at people as a rational behavior, they adopt certain travel choices. It's affected by a number of things: their attitudes, their perception, their experience, and then their preferences. And all these factors are shaped by the context they live in, and vice versa, actually. Their preferences, all those things, their behavior could further shape the context collectively when you look at those behaviors. So as it relates to EV, I'm looking at why in China EV has gone mainstream. It has a lot to do with how people view the EV's benefits, their values, and also how they think it's practical and convenient to adopt this transportation choice. As opposed to in the US, EV is more costly and not necessarily bring the kind of benefits you think you can experience in China. And range anxiety, so all sorts of things, right? And charging infrastructure is inadequate. And fundamentally, in China, I feel the context, the physical, social, and community context, you have the different dimensions to that. And then multiple scalars support people's choice of EV. And that's where my my research is focusing on.
Hi, everyone. Like they said, I'm Paul Lackey. I'm the president of EV Drive, a small company here in Portland. We provide basically EV expertise. So we work with a lot of companies that are interested in getting into electrification. Sometimes it's a startup company. Sometimes it's a large company that wants to move towards electrification. And we work with them to work on proof of concepts, design, kind of prototyping, figuring out how to get them into small-scale production and so forth. So basically, we're just trying to facilitate the move to electrification. People may have the will to do it, but they don't really know how to do it, and we work on getting them over that hump.
Well, good evening, everybody. Let me start by saying very well done on the presentation. As we think about transportation in our country, it's an interesting dynamic because we have long been an industry, and I say an industry because it's not just Oregon, it's not just individuals, it's been a culture. And we've long been a cultural industry of the things that we can do and the things that we build. In fact, even when you look out across the landscape and you say, what are you proud of, at times when you're talking to an engineer, and I am an engineer, so I'll acknowledge that, you talk about the bridges you build or the things that you've constructed. And I think what we've lost along the way at times is that the things that we provide are really about people. And so our bias towards the things has to shift towards the people because that's actually what we're here and who we're here to serve. And as we think about our role in that, as we think about people serving people, it really does change the fabric of how you approach a problem, where you invest, the types of investments, who are they serving. I'm pretty proud to say that coming into the agency, we were able to create a climate office to start working on how do you select projects within this environment to really start to reshape that paradigm that we saw on the screen. But also, how do you do it equitably? Because we have also, unfortunately in our past, as it relates to transportation, we've chosen who gets the benefit and who doesn't. And we have to be creating an environment where we provide access, we provide service, and we treat transportation as an opportunity for all, not just something that serves those that have chosen a specific mode. And as we think about what opportunities might exist in there, we have different complexities that we have to scale, right? We have a large country. And we have a large landmass, and we have geography that really does dictate what you can and can't do in a lot of different places. But as we think about then how we bring that service and that benefit to not just Oregonians, but to the entire country, if you don't center it on who you're serving first, much like we've already heard, you might miss the opportunity. And we're in a space, we're in this, I think, a paradigm shift in transportation, and our job is to feed that shift, and that's what we've been working on.
Hi, everyone. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation and this, I think, a brilliant, panel, and with all the interested students and the young minds and, the people who are going to make decisions for the future. And so I'm very honored to be here. So my main specialty is actually studying China's economic development, especially the government, sort of economic statecraft. How the government provides development financing, industrial policies, trade policies, and other macroeconomic policies, and how that shaped China's sustainable development, and especially right now, the green transition. So I just recently published some, book chapters and also short and commentaries and papers on that specific kind of area. So it's not just transportation. I'm actually not really an industry expert for that matter, but I think it's just very interesting when you look at China and when you look at the United States, and we're looking at so many differences, right? That each country has their strengths, but also tremendous weaknesses that I think that they could learn from each other. And to be honest, I was very sort of concerned about where we are at this point, right? Given that we have a burning planet, and yet I think countries are engaging in a lot of these geopolitical, tensions and just the very uncoordinated and uncooperative kind of protectionism kind of actions. And so I think that really, in a way, worries me. I'm really hoping that, with our industry experts, with our government officials, and with our academias, we could collectively, right, find a way to accelerate the transition to green transportation or the green economy at large. So I'm here to learn, and so, well, thank you so much again for inviting me.
Thanks, everyone. I also just want to let the audience know. Yeah, I want to let the audience know. I've got a couple prepared questions just to harvest the minds of our panelists for the richness of their expertise, after which we will open the floor to audience questions. So be ready, be taking notes in your notebooks, because you will have a chance to engage with our panelists in a Q&A. So our students and I developed some questions that are pretty open-ended, because we really want to know what you think and feel from your areas of expertise in the work that you've done in the transportation sector across such a wide range of entry points. And so we were interested, and we won't go down the line here, it'll be just kind of whoever's ready. Let's start with the problems. What do you feel are some of the greatest challenges, and it would be great if you could ground your answers in a US context or a Chinese context, with, say, the state of our current transportation system, or perhaps the direction it's going? What do you feel are some of the roadblocks that we're running up against? And I'll let whoever's interested in start off.
How much time do you have? So maybe to start the conversation off, I'd offer a few things. The state of our transportation system is struggling. And it's struggling because of past choices. It's struggling because of funding. It's struggling because of how you prioritize the next choice. And it's struggling because all of our policy goals that we are chasing right now, whether it's electrifying the fleet and continuing to increase mileage of vehicles so that you get those higher mileage vehicles instead of the lower mileage vehicles, all of that is contributing towards a future that we want. And yet it's a financially unsustainable future the way it's currently structured. So the structure of our financing system for transportation at the government level, and so I'm grounding this in a government U.S. transportation response, the structure is built upon a gas tax. And the very thing that we want to transition away from is the very thing that funds us. And so as you start to think about your ability to then transition your, not just the things that you're working on and the propulsion method and all of those things, but your tax structure alone is actually creating an impediment to your ability to shift and change as well. That's the first. And then the second is you look at the infrastructure itself, it was designed for a time that is different from the time we live in now. And some would argue that it was designed for things that we actually don't even want today. And so as you think about a future and what you want that to be, you're also looking at a past of 60 years of decisions that have led us to a point to where things have a lifespan. And so the infrastructure, the bridges and things like that have a lifespan. They're not going to last forever. And so we've got to think about how then do we serve all those modes that we all want to foster with an aging infrastructure. Just a side note for us right now, from the state of Oregon perspective, we are funded at a level that puts us on about a 900-year replacement cycle for our bridges. So we've got thousands of bridges across the state. We oversee many, if not most of those, as a state agent. And there are local jurisdictions also that do. And we'll be able to replace all of them in about 900 years, even though they've got about a 100-year or a 50-year design life, depending upon the bridge. So, I mean, you can see the problem. The other thing that I would say is as we think about investing in current infrastructure, we're investing about $100 million to expand the EV network to reduce range anxiety and to increase the shift, to shift folks to EV technology in their vehicles. That is working, but it's at such a slow pace because these things are expensive. You've got to locate them in the right location, and they have to be in a place where people feel safe, comfortable, and willing to stop for a little bit because the refueling takes a little bit longer. So all of those are factors that we're wrestling with in the transportation infrastructure space.
I think very naturally follow your discussion. Think about transportation system. You see there is a problem by looking at the users of this system, how they behave. So earlier, student talked about very high emission level of American generally. There's for a reason. American annually per person drive 13 to 14,000 miles. That's the highest in the world. There are only two countries parallel to this, that's Canada and Australia. China, on average, annual driving distance is 2,500 miles per year, which is also problematic because that has doubled its miles in about 10 years. So China transportation system also has a problem. And I think the users of this system has now become such a car dependent in our society, talking about that. That translates to two things. One is travel using car has become a habitual decision. So whenever people think about travel, one thing they put up in mind is, I'll hop into a car. And then there's also developed this kind of ingrained sense toward entitlement. I'm entitled driving a car and driving it conveniently, which means I expect to have parking place when I get to a place. When I drive on the street, I expect the road is wide enough so that I can drive very fast. So this kind of mentality is on our users of the system. It's shaped by the travel patterns or the behavior pattern they choose. And that actually projected onto the creators of these systems. As Kris just mentioned, the prioritization of funding toward highways, toward freeways, that's based on allow people to move fast, instead of thinking about how to allow people to access services more easily in a more convenient way. And that's also reflected in how our cities are built, how our city is laid out. I'm an urban planner, so I naturally look at how the city is designed, planned. Our US cities is notoriously being sprawling, right? So compare, example, city of Atlanta, metro region, and Barcelona in Spain. This is city equivalent in terms of population size. But Atlanta, in terms of land area, is 3 times of Barcelona. And no wonder people in Atlanta drive 4 times more in a year compared to the people who live in Barcelona. So this physical environment shape our travel behavior, and that's a really challenging thing. Yeah.
I'm actually going to try to follow up a little bit. I'm so curious to learn more about China. And you commented on how our transportation system has been reinforced by our habits. We have created a system that allows us to go fast and far. And China is rapidly changing and obtaining a lot more single family vehicles. What is the habit or the assumptions like for how someone expects to be able to travel in China based on your research and knowledge?
Yeah. So the travel behavior in China for people who are using cars mostly is short-range travel. Mainly because of, earlier mentioned, the medium range intercity travel can be taken care of by trains. So most people, when they travel between, for example, from Beijing to Tianjin, that's about an hour and a half car drive. But because of the high-speed rail system, you can get between the city within half an hour. So imagine that you can do this so much in a short time, and also actually much more convenient and less costly. In terms of the toll cost and then the gasoline cost, even if you're driving EV between these 2 cities, it's more costly than taking the train. Yeah.
Just touching on driver behavior and perception, one thing that I see when I talk to people that I think is a big impediment towards kind of moving towards more electric vehicles and so forth is the perception of what it's like to own and drive an electric vehicle. So, as humans, human nature, when we're confronted with a new concept of something, we map it onto something that we're familiar with. So the new concept is driving an electric vehicle, and we map it onto what we know, which is driving a gas-powered vehicle. And in that case, you drive around wherever you want to go, and once or twice a week, you run out of gas. There's always a gas station a block or 2 away. You go there for 5 to 10 minutes, fill up, and be on your way. And so people, when they imagine driving an EV, they think of it in those terms, and they say, okay, well, it's just like that, except for 1, it'll be hard to find a place to plug in and charge, and 2, I'm going to have to be there for a couple of hours. But if you think of it in a different way, imagine if every morning when you left your house, you had a full tank of gas. Well, how often would you go to a gas station? And the answer is almost never, only when you were doing like long cross-country trips. So that perception, I think a lot of people don't understand. But the problem is that this paradigm only works if you can plug in overnight. And then it's a complete game changer, but so many people don't have access to that. Maybe they live in an apartment. Maybe they live somewhere where maybe their house doesn't have the service to plug in and so forth. And so I see kind of 2 problems here. One is educating people and getting them to understand what it can be like. I can't tell you how much I hate going to the gas station, and it's not just because it's expensive. It's never convenient, and it's so nice, as somebody who drives an electric car, to be able to never do that. Leave every morning with a full tank. But the other thing is we have to find a way to make that available to everybody, no matter what kind of a house or building that they live in.
So I think I'm going to maybe zoom out a little bit from that individual behavior or technological capacity and really focus a little bit more on the context that was mentioned. I think there are a lot of challenges facing us. I mean, in the United States, I start with the corporate, automakers. We know the big three. As a matter of fact, back in 1996, GM already rolled out the first, EV model in the United States. It didn't work because it's not conducive for their bottom line, and there was also lobbying by the fossil fuel industry and the automobile industries to water down on the EV sort of mandates, right? So that basically killed that EV, at that point. Now we have the big three, and they have been increasingly uncompetitive in the global scheme, and we know they used to account for about 70% of the car market in the United States in the 1970s. Now it's down to 44%. Japanese cars, South Korean cars, have taken some of the markets, and now I think, they're facing really a stern competition coming from China, right? The Biden administration has levied 100% tariffs to buy some time. But there's a question, right, which is, are these automakers really have the incentives and also the kind of not just carrots, but also the sticks, right, to really get them act together and try to really invest and reinvest. We have all the stories about the U.S.'s industrial hollowing out. I don't need to repeat too much here, but I just, one of the things that I talked about in my classroom, I teach a class called financialization in the US, right? So we look at stock buybacks, right? It's not until 1982 that we actually legalized stock buybacks by companies. And guess what? The companies are doing it, right? Back in 2022, the S&P 500 has spent $900-some billion to do stock buyback to short the stock prices instead of investing in R&D, their people, their production capacity. And the big three, they took a ton of profits during the pandemic. 65% increase in their profits during the pandemic by 2022. What did they do? They spent $5 billion on stock buybacks, right? So I just think that we have a corporate sector that is a legacy sector, as we just mentioned. They make a lot of money on their gasoline cars, and it's very difficult without the regulations, right, without the governments to in a way guide them and also push them to simply move on to the new world, right, the new EV and the next generation cars. And I think the government is also, in some ways, really need to get their acts together. I'm not talking about at the state level, at the federal level, right? I know that the states are, they are cash, not necessarily strapped, but they have their hands tied, right? But at the federal level, I mean, if China can spend $689 billion investing in green economy last year, why the United States can't, right? I mean, we shelled out $5 trillion during the pandemic, right, with all kinds of stimulus checks and then other industrial policies and so on and so forth. Where did the money come from, right? I mean, the bottom line is we can come up with the money. I think that the constraints are the resources, the political will, right, to really get this done. When I look at the numbers, right, the United States right now, the EV adoption rate is about 8%. You added hybrids, it's about 9%. Europe, 16%. China, 1/3. And I don't think this is just consumer behavior. There are definitely, there is definitely the consumer behaviors right there. But again, I think the government can do a lot more. And the Biden administration has actually walked back from their EV adoption targets, right? In March this year, they announced that the target has gone down from the previous 67% of EV adoption rate by 2032 to now 35%. And the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has also walked back on their regulations. They're saying now we are, we're not going to push certain type of technologies, right? We want to have technology neutral kind of policies for these automobile companies. We're also going to water down on some of the other emission and mileage rating for EVs and so on and so forth. Also, by the way, they are now preaching the so-called, what is it called, the advanced gasoline or something like that, that somehow we can be cleaner, right, with the fossil fuel efficiency and so on. So I just think that, our presenter talked about the two major industrial acts, right? The industrial policies that have in total over $500 billion of incentives to try to build infrastructure, green the economy, and so on and so forth. But still, I think we are lacking some sticks, right? The carrots out there, but we're lacking some regulations. And even, I think, at the federal level, again, we spent $7.5 billion in building public charging stations. How many did we get out of that $7.5 billion? 8, right? And 30% of the public charging stations are not functional in this country. There is estimated 1.2 million shortages of charging stations in this country. And look at China, they built 1.8 million public charging stations, plus the 3.4 million private company built charging stations. They have one charging station for every 2.5 electric vehicles. So I think, in a way, we can't blame the consumers, right? They can't get a charging station. That's not their problem. Not to mention the EV price tag. The average price of EV in the US is $55,000. In China, it's $30,000, right? The entry-level EV here is $29,000. It's Nissan Leaf, right? In China, it's $12,000. So I just think that the government needs to do, and the corporate sector needs to do, and of course, consumers could do better. But I think in China, we also have the same challenges, which is because EV is so affordable, people now drive a lot more than it used to. I went back to China last summer to visit my folks back home. My brother lived in this nice apartment with parking space. So we were about to go to a restaurant, which is, I think, no more than 15 minutes by walking. He's like, go in the car. I'm like, what? What for? We used to walk everywhere. But now it's different, right? Because driving a Tesla X, which is what he has, it's a showcase of the status, right? So get in the car. Let's just, take the car. Even though I think, as we just mentioned, China has this large network of railway. We have 40,000 high-speed rail, which is about 2/3 of the world's total. There are 1.7 billion trips every year taking on that high-speed rail, which is a great, asset. But now people are opting for, more EVs and cars, private cars, and so on and so forth. So I think, I think that mindset needs to be changed. Even EV is more fuel efficient and less, emission. But I think public transportation it's so great in China. I don't think people should let that go, easily. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Oh, that's fantastic. I think that the zooming out was incredibly helpful. I have so many questions already, but I'm going to refrain myself to give you guys chances, because I imagine you've got some. Just to summarize what we've heard here, we heard a lot of struggles with financing. I heard financing at a personal level, at a state level, Oregon, definitely at a national level when you consider corporations and government incentives. So financing seems to be really at the heart of our considerations for transformation. I heard a real theme of infrastructure, of what exists and why it exists the way it does, and the path dependency. How did we get where we are? Who made this world the way it is? And what do we want to do with it now? And what power? So that brought us to political will. And we heard about whether or not we can events change at the national level and how that seems to be trickling down to us at the state and local levels. So without diving into my own questions for you all, let's step aside from the problems and put a smile on our faces. And I want to ask every one of our panelists, what's working well? Right? We've got some good things in this world that are going well. You can look at a long historical timeline or a short historical timeline. It's too easy. I engaged us all in doomsday thinking and all the problems. We like to focus on problems. But there's a lot that is working. So either in a China context or in a US context, from your position and your opinion, what are some things that we can celebrate that we have done and that we are doing, both with our existing transportation structure and where we're moving? And I'm going to say anyone but Yizhao.
One thing that I think is working quite well is the technology. I've been interested in EVs for about 15 years, and I've been working in the EV space for 10 years, and it's just been a marvel to see how the technology has improved during that time. 10 years ago was when EVs first kind of started to become available, and it wasn't great. They didn't have a lot of range. They were extremely expensive. Back then, there was only one vehicle on the market that had more than a 100-mile range. And as somebody who's driven EVs a lot, that 100-mile range is kind of the difference between being able to live a normal life in kind of the urban setting and drive wherever you need to go when you need to go, if you're above that mark versus, can I really go across town if you're below that mark? And there was only one vehicle available at that time, the Tesla Model S, and it was extremely expensive. Today, the EVs are much better in terms of every company has a compelling EV with more than 200-mile range. The prices have come down a lot. There's a long way for it to go, but the prices are getting close to being comparable with gas cars. They're not ugly. Some of the first EVs were kind of ugly. The first EV that I bought, it was a Think City. I call it a Tupperware car. I mean, it was literally made out of plastic. And I found it cute, but not everybody would want to drive that. But the technology has really come a long way, and getting better every year, especially in the battery space. The batteries are what makes the whole technology work, and it's getting better every day. One thing I wanted to touch on in that space is kind of the interplay between the U.S. and China. One thing I've observed, I'm not a huge expert on China, but their ability to industrialize technology is just phenomenal. Just as an example, there's a type of battery called lithium iron phosphate, and this is a battery that is cheaper than traditional lithium-ion batteries. It's safer, it lasts longer, and it uses more commonly available materials to build. And 10 years ago, when I started working in the EV industry, lithium iron phosphate was invented in the United States back in the 90s. And 10 years ago, there was one U.S. company that kind of made the best lithium iron phosphate cell, and there are a couple companies in China that were making some as well. But during those 10 years, the Chinese companies have kind of put their head down and just figured out how to absolutely perfect this technology. And the specifications and the quality of the cells that they're producing now, as well as the cost for which they're able to do it, is something that I never would have imagined would be possible. And to be honest, we don't even make them here because we don't know how to do it at their level. So their ability to industrialize these technologies and perfect them is really amazing to see.
And can I just follow up a bit on that one too, Paul? I know that we have this 100% tariff on EVs from China. When, as a technical person who's in this business, when you're purchasing components for electric vehicles, do you face tariffs or any kind of this geopolitical positioning in your work and in your trade?
Absolutely, and I think that's what kills this, this cross-oceanic, give and take is the geopolitics. I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, we got a tariff on motors and stuff, and those tariffs have never gone away. And I think regardless of what happens in the election, it sounds like they're going to get worse. And so I think geopolitics is the biggest challenge in what should be a really productive relationship between the two countries.
Did you see how I accidentally veered us back to problems? My apologies. All right.
But good things are happening. But yes, there are problems.
All right. So what's working well in either the current state of affairs or where we're going?
Well, I'm happy to jump in. So I actually think we've got a lot to be excited about. So as we think about where we're going, we have to reflect on where we've been in so many ways. And as you think about the policies that have been put in place, specific to Oregon, around transportation policy, we consistently rank in the top 5 across the country for the best transportation policies in place that have the greatest impact for individual users and provide the most access. It's that kind of framing and intentional decision making. And I tell our teams a lot that anything we're not intentional about, we won't do, or at least we won't do it well. And as you think about setting policy for what you want for your future in the transportation space, setting policy where you're top 5 in the country consistently over and over again means you're very intentional and you want an outcome and you've got a plan. And as I think about, I don't have to look far back in my own rearview mirror to see that my parents' generation did the majority of their work with these, right? They were working with their hands, and that's fantastic. And in fact, the work ethic that comes with that is something that I've learned a lot from. What we're evolving into, I think, the next generation who's going to do the majority of the work with the framing the policy. It's going to be the thinkers of the world that are driving what the world gets to be. And I say gets to be, not has to be, because it's a choice. And so as I think about the opportunity that's in front of us, being top in the nation is a good thing for the state of Oregon. We have over 95,000 EVs registered in our state. So we are top 5 in the number of EVs. In fact, I think we're number 3 in the country right now, behind California and Washington. So we're carrying up the West Coast. And all of those things are incremental change that actually produce a bigger picture outcome. And I continue to think that as we look to the future, slight shifts in decision making that still serves those who we've either ignored, forgotten, or displaced, but also serves those into the future in a broader scale, is going to be a fantastic place to be. We protect our environment. It's one of the most beautiful places in the country to live. I don't know how many of you are from. How many of you are from Oregon? Okay. And you chose Oregon, right? It didn't choose you? I mean, I say that half joking. I chose Oregon because of its beauty, because of its people, and because of its direction. And as you think about that, that is a whole lot of optimism that can drive your thinking for making the decisions that the rest of us are going to be living with for the next 50 years.
I also want to echo Paul, and of course I agree. Oregon is so bike-friendly, so beautiful, and we need to keep it that way. But yes, I think technology is really developing so rapidly. So the LFP battery that Paul talked about, CATL, one of the largest battery companies, has spent over 10 years and tried to improve the energy intensity of that battery. So now they have cars that only need to charge for 10 minutes, and it will run over more than 300 miles. So it's going to get better and cheaper for consumers to be able to afford that. But of course, the geopolitical is what is, preventing, I think, a relatively quick adoption of EV and so on and so forth. But again, I think our trade representative has talked about this is the way the U.S. has to play, both defensive, right, buy some time for our corporations to start manufacturing more EVs and batteries, and also play offensive, which is we really need to accelerate technological innovations. The United States is very resourceful. It also has the deepest pocket in the world as far as financial resources are concerned. And again, I think the question is how do we mobilize resources? How do we do this, right? So one of the things that we didn't talk about, but it's very, closely related to EV, actually we did mention, which is the battery, right, which is 40% of an EV value. And of course, the United States has a lot of these critical minerals. My student actually just told me today that apparently in Southern Oregon, they found the largest lithium deposits, right? But I think there's one very recent book, very interesting, called The War Below, which is written by a journalist from Reuters. And they talked about, in the US now, we have 1 lithium mine, 1 cobalt mine, dozen of copper mines, and there's very little processing capacity of, these minerals. And so I think that is critical. I think if the United States really wanted to advance in EV, either they have to really work with China and other countries that have the minerals and the processing power, or they have to somehow come up with those minerals, I don't know from where. There's just a lot of, I think, different interests and different stakeholders in the process, and that makes the whole sort of reventing the whole EV line, the whole battery production in the United States very difficult. The estimate is we're probably going to spend $28 billion to really build up the entire supply chain for battery in this country to be self-sufficient. Now again, it's not the money. $28 billion in the grand scheme of things is a peanut, right? But the really thing is, can we really bring back, right, the mining industry? Or do we want to do that in the first place? It's heavily polluted. A lot of times you have to retake the land from, some of the indigenous, population, and so on and so forth. There's just so many questions about what exactly we wanted to do. What's the end game here, right? If the end game is we wanted to both produce EV in this country and yet still accelerate that green transition, then what would be the strategy? Right, so I think that is really the question. I'm sorry, I think I go back to the challenges again. But again, I think, the technology, the creative minds that we have, and also, when you think about the next generation innovations, right? China now is building, they call flying cars. Geely and some other brands, they have inventing these cars that has wings, right? That the low altitude economy that Chinese government introduced back in 2021. So they're building a lot of these new innovations. The new generation of Z car, the EV, costs about $40,000. It could accelerate from 0 to 100 kilometers in 2 seconds, 2.07 seconds to be exact. The car seat has bed massage. Right, I want to get one of those because I drive to Salem all the time. So they have all kinds of proprietary software that they install in the car. The music can detect the mood of the people and then play music accordingly. I mean, so I think technology is great, and I think the U.S. still has a lot of advantages in there, especially when you think about, again, the amount of money, the amount of data that we have. 70% of global data was processed, and it went through the data centers in Virginia. So we have a lot of resources. We have a lot of tangible and intangible resources. And so I think it's a matter how we strategically think about competition, think about cooperation, think about utilized resources, think about mobilizing resources, think about incentives and regulations. So I think, yeah, the opportunities are there, definitely, but challenges are also abound. Yeah.
I'll be quick. So building on everything's talking about the high-level thinking, the funding mechanism, and then the reorientation of the transportation to not just car, but other transportation modes. There are a lot of things high-level happening, but there's a lot of positive things on the ground happening as well. And I want to use Oregon as an example. Portland City, dubbed as the smart growth capital city, has the best urban design codes that help build urban environment that's very pedestrian friendly and support cyclist activities, and also allow multimodal travel to be part of the street everywhere. We call it complete street code. So in the urban planning realm, from plan making to urban design to development codes to building codes, there's a lot of push we see in the country, led by Portland City as the pioneer, to show that we can do better, we can change our environment. And although it's incrementally, but it's allowing people to see that we can shift our transportation behavior, and then there is option out there to do better.
Great, thank you. So one of the themes that our student co-chairs and committees really wanted to emphasize with this symposium was what we can learn from China and what China might be able to learn from us. So I feel like after we've explored some of the challenges and some of the bright spots, I'd be curious what the four of you may be able to come up with. And I recognize we all have limited perspectives, but the best that you're able to with your life and experience to date, where do you think the best parts that we're doing here in the United States might be able to benefit China, and the best things that China's doing might be able to benefit us? And if you want to expand beyond transportation, if you need to expand your viewpoint to get to where we could think of shared learning or crossing those boundaries, I'd be curious. All right, and Paul started last time, so you're off the hook. Anyone except for Paul.
I'll be brief, because as I think about what probably the greatest asset between the two countries is a recognition of the problem. And so as we think about the future and greenhouse gas emissions and transportation's contribution to that, and not just transportation, manufacturing and other things kind of across the scale and across the spectrum, I actually see a level of competition between the two countries that I think is healthy, because that creates innovation, that creates the technology advances, that creates the desire to share in this global problem. I mean, quite honestly, the greenhouse gas emission issue, especially as it's tied to transportation, right? So in Oregon, a little over 35% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation in the state of Oregon. But Oregon can't solve it on our own. And so it's this interesting dichotomy where we need global partners at scale to help solve this problem, because individual contributions matter, but they won't solve it without that cooperation. And so I actually see the opportunity for cooperation and the competitive spirit of both countries contributing to better outcomes because of that.
I will also be brief. I know I talk too much. I do think that there are a lot that the U.S. can learn from China. I think it's not a healthy debate when we say, China is taking off in that EV space because of subsidies and because of technological theft. Those are very comforting thoughts, right? As if, we are the good people and they're, violating the rule, and that's why they forge ahead. I don't think it's a simple story of subsidy. If that's the case, we could subsidize ourselves until we're blue in the face, and we can go up to that global ladder anytime soon. But that is not an honest reflection, I think, and it really would make us lose the opportunity to really think hard about what we have done wrong, what we have done right, and really get our act together and move forward. So I do think, again, maybe because of my economic training, right? I really see the public sector has a lot role to play, right? Pivotal role. Subsidy is a very small piece of the puzzle for China, right? They have the statecraft. They started investing in mineral mines in Africa 20 years ago. They started with, public R&D 20 years ago. They just mobilized resources in the scale that cannot be imagined in the Western world, I think. So I think there's just a lot to learn from there. Now, what China can learn, of course, is a way that would really encourage innovative entrepreneurship. China has really cut through competition, right? Back in 2018-19, they have about 400, 500 EV makers. Today, there are about 100. And they're still competing. They rolled out model every, 5-6 months, right? Every 12 months at the least. So I think there's a lot of competition. I don't believe in the so-called overcapacity. The global projection is we need 45 million EVs by 2030. The Chinese capacity is right now about 10 million, and is larger supply domestically. Last year, they sold about 8.1 million EVs. So the great majority stays in China. 15% of them are exported out. So I think, again, the geopolitical tensions, I think it's really a barrier that both China and the United States really need to work together in good faith and try to see how we can reshape the global division of labor, not the one size or the winner take all kinds of scenario. But in the technological space, in the global climate change space, I think there's just so much room for both countries to cooperate.
Sorry. One thing I think that we in the United States can learn from China is the power of long-term strategic thinking, which I don't think is our best ability here in the U.S. And in the in the EV space, we've seen a lot of kind of oscillation and ebb and flow in the development over here in the United States. As she mentioned, back in the late 90s, we were starting to get into EVs. There was actually a mandate in California that said, you have to build EVs, and all the companies kind of dragged their feet and made a crummy little EV. Actually, General Motors made a great one, but they hated selling it. You can't believe how much they hated selling it. And so, they worked to get that mandate repealed, and we stopped doing anything with EVs for another 10 years. And then another smaller mandate kind of kick-started the new kind of development of EVs. But even just in the last couple of years, I've seen, a lot of oscillation in the industry. 1 year, all the big car companies are like, all right, we're going to go all in on EVs. We're going to build these factories. And then the next year they say, you know what, we're not sure the market's moving there as fast as we thought, so we're going to cancel all those. And it's just really inefficient to work that way. And, here in the U.S., we tend to kind of change our strategies every 4 years or so. Over in China, they said, you know what, we can see this is something that we want to do. This is something we need to do. This is something we want to be the world leaders in. And they're just working on that. And it's amazing how fast they have, closed the technology gap. Even if some of the stuff that maybe we initially innovated, like I mentioned, the LFP batteries, they've just left us in the dust. That kind of long-term strategic thinking is the only way that you get something like the high-speed rail network that they have. You can't just do that, year to year and on a whim. So that long-term strategic thinking is something I think that we really need to learn from them, and also, to figure out how to cut through some of the barriers to that kind of development in terms of like permitting and so forth.
Great, that was really spot on, the difference between these two countries. Obviously, there are ideological differences in terms of political system, and that caused to the big differences with or without strategic thinking, with or without this national framework that would guide lower level of implementations. In the US, there's no national transportation policy. There's no national land use policy. There's consistently the resistance even to have local government transportation planning to consider regional needs. That's widely kind of a persistent issue in the U.S. But I think this part is definitely U.S. can learn from China is thinking about something that's a whole society approach to make change. To at least identify the relevant stakeholders and bring people together and use that process to figure out the solutions. One example is, for example, in China, the charging station that's implemented nationwide, 50% of charging stations worldwide is in China. You can see that scale implementation. And then the main player that implement this and control this process is the China State Grid. That's the energy supplier that's heavily involved in this process. But in the US, the charging station installation has no place where you see the energy supplier come in. Last year, I have a project, our students are trying to figure out where our campus fleet will be electrified and where are they going to put more charging stations. And that request to find that information comes from our local electricity supplier, EWEB. And you know that EWeb wants to find out this plan, our university's plan, to be better prepared because they think there will be a surge in electricity demand if our campus fleet become electrified. This is just a small example to see the lack of communication between the major players in this process. Right? So I think this is one thing that US can learn. The other thing is, come back to the technology. China, the technology is not just the battery part, it's also the digital features, the intelligence system that put in the car. And then this really driven by the desire to meet consumer needs. Their market study, their understanding of what consumer wants in their car is remarkable. I've had a chance to read BYD's market report, some other companies' market report. They're talking about targeting, if we have older people driving this car, what kind of feature we need? If we have couple with young children, we need to build in a system we can detect children if they are left in the car. You know, that things happen in the US with tragic outcome. So the digital part of the EV car now accounts for 45% of cost. It's more than the battery now. And I think this is what the US car company can really learn from the Chinese companies. The other thing is the policy part. So we have this term called policy tourism, which means people go to a different place. In China, it's called 取经, which means you go to a different place, they have good policy, you learn, and then you adapt it, take it back to your place, and then try to adapt to your local condition. And in the past, for years, I run a program that accepts Chinese visiting professionals, planners mainly, coming to the US to learn about US policies. That's the policy tourist. They come here to learn about Oregon's urban growth boundaries. They come here to learn about Portland's Green Street programs. And I think it's time for US to go to China to learn about their policies, particularly as it relates to urban planning. So for example, major cities in China, the development codes now already incorporated requirement for EV charging station in any parking space. So for example, in city of Shenzhen, it's required any new buildings, your parking space provided, 30% of parking space has to be EV charging ready. Either you prepare the wire to have EV charging station cooked, or you have charging station ready. So this kind of a mandate is not just incentive-wise, it's a mandate really push the infrastructure building to a much higher level. So I feel like this mutual learning is really crucial. For the Chinese side, obviously the system is top-down. The implementation is very effective and it's forceful. It doesn't not go without problems. In many places, the implementation lack public engagement, lack public input. So how do you engage public, have public participation in this process, and really better understand the consumers' needs? I think China can really learn from the US's, the community involvement strategies, the mechanism. So allow this bi-directional policy learning, I think is really crucial.
Thank you. All right, audience, it's your turn. So there's 2 more mics, wireless mics on the podium, and we've got some mic runners who can wander through. Oh, look at those hands. All right. Did you have 2 up there? Perfect.
Just project.
Just project for a moment.
Okay, so I have a question. Dr. Yang, you talked a lot about like how human behavior affects the choice of I want to know from all of you, what do you think it's going to take for the average American to care
about? So remember when I talk about the people-centered approach, so think about the travel behavior. and then the choice of different types of vehicle, that's a rational decision. And that's affected by your attitudes, your perception, your experience, and your preference. Each of these concepts could have offer you intervention point. So attitudes comes in, refers to your belief in the benefits of adopting this behavior, having this particular choice. So the public, if they are better understand the EV's benefits, immediate benefits, air quality improvement. In fact, a lot of people I interact in China, their most immediate experience of using EV as the individual level and the community as a whole is they see the improvement in air quality. So China is, all the cities, notorious traffic congestion. And right now we have cities EV adoption at 30%. In the southern part of China, cities EV production is close to 40 to 45%. That has significant and very evident impact on air quality. So allow people to see that connection, allow people to see the be aware of these benefits they have, that could change their attitude. And then working on their perception and experience is get them to experience driving EV. So in China, some of the cities have EV zones. The zone only allow EVs to come in because the traffic congestion, because of air quality issue. So you can experience the changes because of EV's concentration. And a lot of the EV companies, they have specific test driving program and allow people to experience the features and the good quality. And then the next thing is preference. Preference comes in, people were given options, different options. You have ICE vehicle, you have EV, what do you choose? So you have to help them make that rational choice. One thing is the gasoline price, when it goes higher, people will switch to EV, which we see this happen in the US. So I feel like there is role the government policy can play in to change that level playing field, like to make EV feels relatively better choice. So in China, all the EV cars has green plates, and that adds to people's kind of a pride in protecting the environment. And EV are allowed to have easy access to license plate. And EV is not restricted by the days when they're allowed to enter the city, although this kind of policy is phasing out. And EV is cheaper to operate. Cars, electricity is subsidized if you charge your EV. So there's a lot of things in China, particularly, that allow people to have a better experience using EV compared to the other options.
If I can just add something, if you're talking about getting the average American to care about, going to EVs and sustainable transportation, I'm not sure there is an average American, and so you have to use a multitude of different, different methods to reach out to different people. So a lot of people will do it because they care about the environment, they want to decarbonize, they want clean air and so forth. But that doesn't motivate many people, and in fact, that can be a disincentive for some people. Some people are like, "Oh, I don't want to, side with the granola eaters or whatever." And so, for those people, you have to find a different incentive, and it might be that EVs are more fun to drive. They are. They're fast. They're zippy, and they're quiet, and it just feels like you're on a roller coaster. So that's going to motivate a lot of people. Some people will like that they're quiet. Other people don't want it to be quiet, and you have to put a noisemaker in it. And some manufacturers are doing that. So there's all these different incentives that will motivate people, and you just kind of have to. Some people will want to get off foreign oil, the issue with cost is another thing. Right now, EVs are a little more expensive than gas cars, but that won't be true for long. They're inherently simpler machines, and over time, they will be cheaper. But if I think back to, 25 years ago, at the very beginning of this transition, it was when hybrids came out. And I think the one thing that got the most people to switch to hybrids back when the Toyota Prius came out was that sticker that got them in the carpool lane. So there's so many different incentives that that different people respond to.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add, but I agree. I think the price range is one thing, the road anxiety, right? So there are some low-hanging fruits that if we could do, but there's also maybe the medium range, if we could provide more public transportations, so then people don't have to worry about the road range, right? The Chinese consumers' range anxiety is about half of the U.S. Because again, they don't worry, they have to drive a long way. It's a lot of times for short distance traveling. And also, I think the new designs that could get people excited about it. I think that's also very important. I do have friends back in China and said the exact same thing, that Americans love cars that has big noise and big smell of gas. So people are not going to change. I was like, maybe the older generation, right? But I mean, the young generations now. I have school age boys. They love Tesla, right? They have fun with it, and they think it's just computers on wheels, more or less. But I do think that people being informed will be a good thing. It was funny because we were talking about electric vehicles in my class, and some of my students start to say, it caught fire so easily, and all kinds of malfunctioning of their software. I'm like, really? I'm driving one. Don't scare me. But I think it gets so much media attention when something goes wrong with the EV. But as a matter of fact, it's super safe. Compared to, it's just you don't see all those big reports about a gas car caught fire, but somehow Tesla is always there, and so on and so forth. But again, I think for new generations, that car culture can change. But there are some hard constraints in terms of the budget, in terms of the charging stations, and I think those need to be, in some ways, resolved before the mass adoption.
Hi. I don't know if this is on, but I'll speak loudly. On kind of like the idea of people's incentives to, move towards EV or move towards, greener forms of transportation. I think this is just a curiosity question with there is a significant portion, while it might not be the majority, but a significant portion of the, US population that doesn't really believe that, the things like the climate are an inherent crisis, or believe that that's something that's happening. Is that something that exists in the Chinese population or in the Chinese mindset when it comes to public transportation? That's something I haven't necessarily thought of before. And if it does exist, or if it doesn't exist, how do those two ideals, work in how the United States and China are, moving in the EV sector?
I think in China, the mainstream, be it public media or at the governmental level, there is a genuine acknowledgement and recognition of climate change and what we need to do to reverse that, if not slow it down. So, to slow it down, if not reverse it. So I do think that, it is on the back of people's minds when they think about EV adoptions, but there are also other incentives. Not just that we're doing something good for the environment, but air pollution is a real threat in China, right? It's not until 2008 that we start to see really environmental improvements. That was right when Olympic Games started in Beijing. They shut down a bunch of factories. They finally get these blue skies. And so that's really when people recognize we need to do something about transportation, even though I think as the earlier presentation says, it only accounts for about 9% of China's CO2 emission. But still, I think there is a recognition that climate change is real, environmental pollution is real, and we need to do something about it. Yeah.
This is a question directed to Paul. In America, the combustion engine is so well established that there's auto shop classes at high school, and everybody has their own local mechanic, and it's a common trade. People even work on cars for upkeep. So I'm curious, how difficult and complicated is the upkeep of an average EV, and how feasible is it for the traditional mechanic to be able to understand those systems, and also for a new EV owner to understand the systems of the car?
Sure, yeah. So, one big difference between older gas cars and EVs is that an EV has to be a computer. There's a central computer that controls all the components and makes it all work together. And, that, I think, is something that's kind of a challenge for your traditional mechanic. But that's kind of been true for gas cars as well over the past probably 20 years. Those have all become computer-based as well. And so, kind of the concept of being a mechanic, I think has to change a little bit. So, one thing about EVs is that they have a lot less service that needs to happen with them. If you look at a gas engine, it's just an amazingly complex part with all these moving parts that get like super hot and they're rubbing against each other. Things wear out. You have to replace rings and so forth. With an EV, that's just not the case. The motor is simple. It's got a single bearing, and that's it. And so there's less servicing that can happen that way, but it becomes more a question of checking things on the computer. Are the batteries working right? You have to log into the computer on the vehicle to do that. And so I think that it becomes a much more of a technological thing than kind of a wrenching on stuff. And so one thing that's kind of related with that is the concept of right to repair. As the world has become kind of more computer-based over the past 20 or 30 years, a lot of that stuff has been kind of locked behind passwords, and you don't even have access to it. And so, there's been a lot of people who have been pushing for legislation to say, hey, no, I want to be able to get access to everything I need to do to fix my own stuff that I buy. This idea that, I bought this, it's mine, I need to be able to fix it, is something that people are kind of grappling with right now. And I think that there's some momentum towards that, but without that, all the companies, they just put everything behind a firewall, and you literally can't do anything to fix it.
All right, microphone runners. Here, I'll help you out. Oh, you're going? Great.
My question is for Dr. Liang mainly. You mentioned financialization and as a major obstacle to renewable energy transition in the United States, and you mentioned public sector and regulations as possible solutions, and it seems like China is really the only country in the world that's able to significantly expand its public sector and increase regulations in the past 5 to 10 years. In fact, like all over the world, the International Monetary Fund is still compelling countries to deregulate and reduce their public sectors. And I wonder if you could explain how China's managed to prevent financialization or reverse it, and how like the political will can be generated to do these things, especially in the United States. I've worked as a political activist myself, and I find it's extremely difficult to even like regulate corporations, like even to regulate lobbying. If the corporation you're trying to regulate will lobby against you and has that power.
So we could spend hours to talk about this, but I think just really the long story short is that, I think in China, the decision is made by, the top leaders in the country. And the lucky thing is so far they haven't made really big mistake. There's always, like we talked about the long-term strategic thinking and the fact that the US politicians cannot look beyond 4 years. And I think for China, that fortunately is not the case. So they do have this long-term strategic thinking. And a lot of the career officers, they are engineers, they are scientists, they're practical, pragmatic people. They understand, finance is fictitious capital, right? That the Marxian thinking, I think, is still pretty long-lived in the Chinese leaders' mind. So I think all of these basically allow them to say, we wanted to beef up our manufacturing capacities. We don't like financial interests to take over. That's why I think they also, as you might know, a lot of the media talking about Chinese economy is collapsing because they started this really prick the bubble in the real estate sector because, the slogan, the housing is for live-in, not for speculation. So I think all of these just point at, because of the, ideology, because of political thinking, also because they simply don't have a big financial sector that would have the regulatory sort of capture, right? I think that allow them to really focus more on industrial capacity and the really sort of the, build a country with real kind of production and real welfare for the people. But I think there's definitely shortcomings of that system, right? That what if there is a mistake, then that correction process would be very difficult. But again, I think fortunately we haven't seen the big directional mistake at this point. I think that's as much I can sort of get to it. I think that in the United States is really that financial power, interest, and institutions have gained too much power since the late 70s, 80s, when we have both the so-called financial innovations and financial deregulations at the same time. And I think that makes it very difficult to reverse that process.
Okay, my question is like a few different parts because I don't know how to put it in one question, but what are your thoughts on the sustainability of EVs in battery production or the feasibility of them working long term? And this could be like economically, environmentally, socially, or is there maybe like a transition to even something else after those?
So that's a question that I hear a lot is, are EVs really, are they really greener? You have to mine all this stuff for the battery. And it's true that, it does take more energy, it takes more material to build an EV than it does to build a gas car. But if you think about the things that you're mining at once for the EV. You go get some lithium, some copper, some aluminum, all these things that go into the battery. You do that once, and as opposed to when you mine, for lack of a better word, oil and turn it into gasoline, you burn it and then you get some more the next day. And so there is that initial increase in kind of impact when you build the car, but it's very, very quickly overcome by the fact that it's more efficient and it's not requiring that you put fossil fuels into it every day. And then the other thing is that the battery in an EV is very recyclable. It's made mostly out of copper, aluminum, lithium, a few other things. These are things that are valuable. You wouldn't throw those things away, and so. At the end of the lifetime of the car, you recycle those things, you can get over 95% of the material back and use it again. And so as time goes by, the impact of those minerals goes down and so forth. And so, there isn't a huge battery recycling industry yet. And the reason for that is that the batteries last a long time. So one of the big misconceptions that I hear is like, oh, your battery's going to die after a couple of years. That's kind of people are used to that because that's how their phones work. Phones get very hot. The battery's always hot, and that's really bad for phones. And they don't design the batteries to last. In the EV, the batteries, especially these days, the batteries they're putting into them now, they last for the life of the car. And afterwards, they can be repurposed for like grid storage and so forth. And it's only after a couple of decades that they really are end of life, and then you recycle them and use them again.
I can add some numbers to what you're talking about. So BYD's recent battery, their warranted lifelong time is 600,000 miles, which lasts longer than a car. And China has already established nationwide battery recycling policies now. And then the expectation is by 2036, the first generation of EVs, their battery is going to be recycled, reused. And I was able to listen to a panel while I was in China this summer. They were talking about technologically, they can recycle 95% of material in the battery. So it's a very, very significant reduced environment impact. And also talking about the EV itself, the savings in the carbon, indeed, a carbon print is greater when you produce an EV compared to regular ICE vehicle. But the carbon savings really comes from the lifelong operation. So you think about one EV costs about 5 to 8 metric ton carbon emission versus average ICE that's 4 to 6 for manufacturing production. But on average a year, because ICE car produce about 15 metric ton of carbon oxide emission versus EV has 0 emission, although the electricity generation has carbon footprint as well, but that's much smaller than the emission. So the savings from the lifelong operation is estimated to be 30 to 50 metric ton. So it's like about 1.5 years you can offset that initial greater carbon print. So environmentally, having an EV, it is environmental sustainability is a better impact, although the ideal situation is you don't drive at all, right? So you don't have that initial impact. and so I think there's also the social impact with EVs now in China. They have this strategy of thinking about you as an EV manufacturer, and then you push everything to a dealership, and then you walk away. I think in China right now, they're talking about one company take care of their customer from beginning to the end when the EV battery is recycled. So I think the company is called NIO. Their strategy is when the cars get out of the factory, from that moment, every single issue that customer has, ranging from a loosened bolt in the car to any software upgrading to any issues with EV battery, is taken care of by the company. So there's this kind of a completely new kind of a consumer service care model now is emerging in China.
That's great.
I just want to add one sentence on that. I think, I also wanted to just emphasize, I think there's also great potential for China to continue to promote public transportation. There are over 500,000 e-bus in China right now. That's about 77% of the total bus fleets, right? So I think promoting more public transportation would also be super helpful as far as the environment is concerned.
Let's give it up one more time. We're out of time for questions. Let's give our speakers a great hand.